Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today, we're jumping back into some ProRevenge. Our first story today comes to us from Son Don't Play. Don't want to let me tinker? Alrighty then, let's do business then. Let's jump right in. My grandpa was a successful man, and in his mid-60s, he decided he wanted to take a step back. So he started selling off his businesses. He sold his various businesses and spent the next few years traveling. As he approached 70, he got bored in addition to a few new grandchildren, so he needed a bigger house. He sold the old home that he had bought after he got back from Vietnam and bought this massive house on this large piece of land. This property also came with a massive steel barn. Not sure if he had ever told anyone about his plans, but right after he got the property, he dumped a ton of money into tools and equipment and converted his barn into a mechanic's dream. Some things I remember: he had a professional lift capable of lifting full-size trucks. He had those professional oil catchers you see at Quick Lubes. He had a dedicated air compressor system that was designed to power all his power tools. He had a tire machine to mount new tires. He had so much equipment. His tool corner was a massive corner of this massive barn. His plan: to fix cars, especially for people in need. He lived in a rural community. If you didn't have a car, that was a big problem. So he let everyone know at his local church that he was willing to work on their cars if they provided the parts. He only took a few jobs a week. He was doing this to enjoy himself and help those that needed it. He'd of course change oil, change the transmission fluid, and all kinds of various repairs. My grandpa was a talented mechanic. However, he kept the amount of work limited. He was also selective. If you were in need, he'd want to fix your cars. If you had the means to pay, he'd decline and ask you to go elsewhere. One day, the owner of the local car dealership came by and told my grandpa he needed to stop fixing other people's cars because he wasn't properly licensed, didn't have the proper insurances, and was hurting his business. My grandpa explained this is just his hobby. He only does a few cars a week. The owner told him he needs to cut it out or he's going to sue my grandpa out of business. My grandpa said he laughed over this. What business was this guy going to sue him out of? The owner walked out. A little while later, my grandpa got served. He was being sued by the owner of the car dealership. My grandpa thought he'd take a trip down to the dealership and try and reason with the man. My grandpa hoped he could come to an understanding. My grandpa spoke to the owner and basically explained he only works on people's cars who are down on their luck. The fact is, the people's cars he fixes probably couldn't afford to pay a professional dealership to fix their vehicle. He only does a few cars a week. He's not all that interested in getting into a fight over his hobby, but he ain't gonna back down. Well, they ended up in court. By this point, my grandpa had hired a lawyer who was able to get the city to approve a commercial garage on his property. It helped that he lived on the outskirts of town and had 6 acres of property. The court told my grandpa his auto repair shop is operating illegally. If my grandpa wants to continue, he's gonna need to get a business license, get the proper insurances, and if he does that, he will be good to go. Now, what do you think a man who has nothing but time and money in this situation is going to do? He's going to get his business license and insurances, of course, which he did, and that surprised no one. But he went further. Got a dedicated phone line ran into his shop, hired a full-time mechanic, put up a professional sign, set up a little waiting area with a water cooler. What shocked everyone even more, he ran a local TV ad saying he was a pay-what-you-can mechanic shop, reservations only. Put ads in the local paper saying the same thing. Yes, folks, that's right. My grandpa is not only a licensed, legal auto repair business, he has a certified mechanic on his payroll, and he's running ads. As for his prices, they were quite simple. You either bring the parts yourself and pay the mechanic whatever you wanted. The mechanic got a separate wage from my grandpa, so if you couldn't pay anything, that was fine. Had my grandpa sourced the parts, he'd charge you the parts and you'd pay the mechanic whatever you want. My grandpa started taking jobs. And boy did that shop get busy. It was impossible to beat Grandpa's price. Grandpa was essentially paying to fix your car for you. My grandpa would spend his days with a mechanic that he had hired working on cars. He loved it. The owner of the local car dealership was furious. He sued my grandpa again. They went to court, and the judge basically said my grandpa owned a licensed, insured auto repair business. What he charges his customers for his services is completely up to him, even if that means doing the work for free. About a year or so later, my grandpa gets a call from a lawyer who says he's representing a potential buyer of the local car dealership. However, the buyer wants to speak to my grandpa. My grandpa agreed. He sat down with the new potential buyer who expressed his concerns about buying the dealership. Service is a major profit center for a dealership, and he's considering buying the local dealership. However, he doesn't want to buy the dealership if my grandpa is going to keep operating the way he is, because it's impossible for a for-profit business to compete against someone selling their services for free. My grandpa agrees that there's no way someone looking to make a profitable business could ever compete against him. So they came to an agreement. The owner buys the dealership, and my grandpa would only work on a few cars a week, maybe 5 or 6, only work on people's cars who are down on their luck, and probably too poor to be able to pay a professional dealership to fix their car. Any parts he needs, he will buy from the dealership. Any work he declined, he'd refer to the dealership. The new owner of the dealership agreed to. Dealership must agree to let my grandpa B stay out of his way. Dealership must hire his mechanic. They shook hands. The local dealership was bought out, and for the next 9 years, my grandpa would fix people's cars who were down on their luck. If he had to buy parts, he'd buy them from the dealership. And as for that mechanic my grandpa hired, he ended up becoming the service manager and did quite well for himself. As for my grandpa, when he was 80, he had a heart attack in his shop. Luckily, one of his grandkids was there and they got him to the hospital, and he made a full recovery. But the doctor told him his body couldn't handle working in that garage anymore. He ended up shutting down after that. For the next 3 years, he looked out his kitchen window, staring at his shop, remembering all the fun he had in his garage. He passed away at 83, surrounded by friends and family. Now, down in the comments for this one, it was mentioned that they really like when people have FU money and they use it for good, unselfish deeds. Well, OP responded to that one, and it gives a bunch more details, so I figured you guys would probably like to hear this part as well. It says, he did have FU money. My dad was concerned with the fact that my grandpa was paying a mechanic a full-time wage, yet not bringing in any revenue to even set off the mechanic cost. My grandpa said, son, I could write that man, the mechanic, a check right now, so large that he could live comfortably for the rest of his life and never work again. So don't worry about what I'm paying him. My grandpa was a successful businessman, but he always had compassion. He did a lot of things throughout his life for the benefit of others. He once told me he believed in karma, and what goes around comes around. So if he helps someone out, even if that person can never repay him, one day, some way, he will get repaid. I'm just rambling, but as an example, there was this family, husband, wife, and 3 kids. Well, the husband was killed in a car accident. The wife was struggling to make ends meet. At the time, my grandpa owned a grocery store. For the first month after her husband passing, my grandpa refused to charge her for the groceries she bought. The woman got a job. It didn't pay a lot, but it was a job. She insisted she pay. My grandpa agreed, but she'd get a 50% discount. Any grocery store that's giving a 50% discount on everything is losing money. When she got promoted at her job several years later, my grandpa went back to charging her full price. Now, OP mentioned in that one that they were rambling, and that's where that comment ended, but then somebody right underneath that one said, please keep rambling. I could read stories about this man all night. So OP continued on, and let's jump into that one. It says, when my grandma was 17, she was assaulted and as a result got pregnant. I believe this was shortly after World War II. Back then, having a child out of wedlock was a no-go, and her parents made her marry her assaulter. 4 years later, my grandpa comes along and he meets my grandma and falls head over heels in love with her. My grandma jokes one of the first things he said after meeting my grandma was, "I'm gonna marry you and spend the rest of my life with you." She thought he was a cocky prick and wanted nothing to do with him. At the time, my grandma was separated from her husband, the one who assaulted her, raising her daughter, now my aunt. The relationship between my grandma and grandpa grew, and eventually my grandma divorced her husband and married my grandpa. This all happened shortly before my grandpa was to be sent to the Korean War. After he got back from the Korean War, he was told he had orders to go to Japan for an assignment and he was able to bring his family. The problem was, he could take my grandma, that wasn't an issue, but he couldn't take my aunt unless he adopted her, and the only way he could adopt her was if her father agreed to the adoption. My grandma tried to get the ex-husband to agree and he wouldn't. My grandpa attempted and he refused. They were living in Texas at the time, and the father of my aunt was in Colorado, so my grandpa traveled to Colorado to negotiate with my aunt's father. His negotiations were successful, and my aunt's father agreed to let my grandpa adopt my aunt as his daughter. He refused to ever tell anyone the terms of the agreement between him and my aunt's biological father. Every once in a while, it'd become a topic of conversation, and we'd want him to tell us the details of the agreement. And every time he said, "We made a deal," we both held up each other's ends of the deal, and it's no one's business what was agreed upon. Even to this day, no one knows how he managed to get the man to agree to let him adopt my aunt, but he did. I know a lot of Redditors are going to assume he used violence. That much we know he did not do. We know this because the negotiations happened at my grandma's parents' house, and they were at home at the time. They weren't involved in the talks, but they said there was no violence, just an agreement made. Anyway, him and my grandma were married for 59 years before he passed. They had a boy, my dad, and a daughter together. One thing that jumped out at me from this one is that back in those days, your problems were solved face to face. There weren't any keyboard warriors or anything like that. It was just you and the person you had the problem with, and you tried to work it out together. Something we definitely learned from this story though is you never mess with a guy who has the time to plot the revenge. And even more so, you don't mess with the person who has the time and the money to plot that revenge. Do me a quick favor, have a look down below the video. If that subscribe button's still red, it means you're not actually subscribed to the KCC channel. Please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Our next story today comes to us from Evil Test Matcher, the results of my yard work. Let's jump right in. I posted this in another subreddit, but it was suggested I also try it here, so here it is. First, let me say that I'm not 100% certain this is ProRevenge, because I don't necessarily think of myself in that league. I live in a consolidated county. That means that the city and county's governments merged some years back, ostensibly to reduce administrative and infrastructure costs. This is important because services like fire, police, utilities, and trash pickup are now managed by former county officials and not the city officials. Many of these services are also much more inefficient, and some services have been outsourced to private companies. My municipality outsourced trash and yard waste pickup a few years ago, and the two companies who now do those collections are woefully inadequate, and their services cost more than when the city or county did it. They both have similar sets of rules, what can be put out for collection, take fewer types of waste away, and no longer come 2 days a week as the city once did, and now only come 1 day a week. We're all paying more money for less service. Now that the background is done, here's the story. I did some yard work over the course of a couple of weekends last summer, cutting some limbs, trimming some shrubbery, and cutting down a dead tree in my backyard. Knowing what the rules are for how much yard waste, limbs, leaves, and such can be put out, I bagged everything that was supposed to be bagged, filling up 3 of them. Things like leaves and small clippings, weeds, and such. The paper bags for yard waste from the big box home improvement stores are what they require, so I use those. I just fill them halfway up so as to not make them too heavy for the waste collectors, even though there are no written weight restrictions. However, if a bag is too full, they will knock it over to spill out the contents, so then they don't have to pick it up. I cut the larger limbs down to under 4 feet in length or they wouldn't be picked up. Anything at all they can do to get out of picking something up, they will do. and they almost always leave a horrendous mess behind when they do pick things up. The pile put out for collection is not allowed to be any wider than 10 feet, nor any deeper or higher than 5 feet, nor may it contain any piece longer than 4 feet. All bags must be placed in a row no more than 3 feet away from the limb pile. My pile was maybe 4 inches longer than the 10 feet, and only because of the tiny ends of the limbs, smaller than a toothpick, hanging out of the pile. The pile was no higher than 3 feet, and no deeper than 4 feet. In other words, it fell within the size limits except for a few twigs with leaves. I also had the 3 bags, each about half full of clippings and leaves, all lined up exactly as required, and about 2 feet away from the main pile. They were scheduled to come on a Tuesday, but when I got home from work that afternoon, it was all still there. There was a pre-printed notice on my door that my pickup exceeded the prescribed size limits, and the note said that I would be required to either pay a $250 oversized load fee or reduce the size of the pile by half to make it fit into the limit. This is where the revenge comes in. I had the next 2 days off, so the next morning, bright and early, I got out the hedge trimmers. I trimmed the ends of the pile back to exactly 9 feet in length. After carefully laying those trim bits on top of the pile, I went to the backyard where the limbs I had not trimmed up the week before were stacked for the following week's pile, and found 4 long, fairly straight limbs. I removed all the smaller limbs and leaves from these limbs, ending up with 4 moderately straight poles, each about 7 feet long. I marked 1-foot intervals on each pole in fluorescent orange paint and stuck them in the ground, out of the curb in the front yard, at the corners of a rectangle exactly 5 feet wide and 10 feet long. Got out the surveyor's tape, bright pink plastic tape used to mark property corners, and tied it onto and around the stakes at the height of 5 feet. This established a visual outline of the volume I was required to stay within. I made absolutely sure that everything in the pile was completely inside the poles and below 5 feet in height. This required adding almost 2/3 of the remaining pile in the backyard to the stack out front to bring it up to 4 feet 6 inches in width, 4 feet 6 inches in depth, and 9 feet 6 inches in length, and no piece longer than 46 inches. The pile was almost twice as much material as before. This included some small logs up to 4 inches in diameter, also each 46 inches long. The limit is 5 feet diameter, all within the limits of the 5 foot by 5 foot by 10 feet the waste company mandates. I carried each of the 3 bags of clippings to the backyard and filled each of them up as much as possible, while still being able to fold over the tops and staple shut each bag. I also included small 8 to 10 inch sections of the ends of the larger limbs for added weight. The bags were now completely filled and weighed more than twice what they had before. I had to use the hand truck to get them out to the curb, they were so heavy. Oh, and all the extra clippings I had generated filled up 2 more bags, so the total was now 5 bags, the company limit. I then went inside, called the company, and very nicely asked that they come to pick up my yard waste since they had not done so on Tuesday. They agreed to send out a truck and crew and told me I would have to pay the fee. Come on then, I told them. They soon arrived and happened to be the same crew that normally comes to my neighborhood. I pulled a 25-foot Stanley tape measure from my pocket and asked them to measure the poles to confirm that the space was within the required limits. They did so and agreed the pile was not oversized, and proceeded to spend the next 2 hours manually loading it all onto their truck. Oh, and it took both of them to manhandle each of those bags into the back of the truck too. I told them very nicely and with a smile that I knew what 10 feet was, pointed to the fence where it was marked with an orange electrical tape, and thanked them for coming to pick up my yard waste. The 2 tired, sweaty waste disposal guys just groaned, got in their truck, and drove off. There was no extra fee added to my bill for that month, never has been since. Now, I know they got paid for their time, and I know that I had to do a lot of extra work on my day off, but since last July, I have not once ever had them leave so much as a single leaf on the ground in front of my house. They had to actually do some hard work, with me standing there in shorts, smiling, and drinking cold Gatorade while they were sweating. I do love that OP got their revenge, but could you imagine if the people that came out to pick up that new pile weren't the ones that had refused to pick up the one previously? That'd be a lot of extra work for people that didn't really deserve the revenge. Check out both OPs linked in the description down below. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.